At the dinner. My family mocked me as poor. Then I pulled out the real estate contract. The chandeliers of Oakwood. Estate glimmered above a long mahogany table, meticulously set, with vintage crystal silver cutlery and porcelain plates bearing the Brookshire crest. Everything about this dinner screamed tradition, old money, old rules, old wounds. Evelyn Moore took her usual seat near the far end by the fireplace. The air smelled of rosemary lamb, aged wine and perfume with names she'd never care to remember. She smoothed her thrifted black cardigan over her simple blouse, ignoring the quiet snickers already beginning at the other end of the table. Evelyn came Aunt Lorraine's voice, sharp as a pearl-handled knife you made it. I'm surprised your little schedule could accommodate us. She smiled coolly. Wouldn't miss it. Not unless I wanted to spend another year being accused of abandoning family tradition. Cousin Chloe tilted her head, flicking a curl behind her ear with performative elegance. Is that the same sweater from last Christmas? She asked with a syrupy smile. It still fits, Evelyn replied evenly, reaching for her water glass. Chloe's eyes sparkled. That's the thing about old fabric. It stretches so much, doesn't it? Laughter rippled down the table. Evelyn sipped quietly. Let them. Let them believe I'm just a little thread in this tapestry they've woven from illusion and legacy. They've never looked close enough to see what's underneath. Cousin Blake leaned forward, the Rolex on his wrist, glinting like a badge of honour, still driving that. What is it again? A 98 or Toyota, it runs, Evelyn said simply. Chloe coughed into her napkin. That's not the point, Evie. You're 36 and still renting a one-bedroom in a walk-up. I bought that building 3 years ago under Moorfield Holdings. They don't know that I own every unit on that street except mine. I pay rent to myself. For tax purposes. She smiled again. I like the view. Aunt Lorraine set her wine glasses down with purpose. When are you going to get serious, Evelyn? Your mother tells me you're still dabbling in real estate. Dabbling. I've closed 6 commercial deals this quarter, restructured 2 urban housing projects, employed 200 people under an LLC they'd never even bother Googling. It keeps me busy, she replied softly. It's just, Lorraine continued, eyes narrowing. We worry. You're part of this family. You carry our name. But it's like you're choosing not to represent us. You mean I'm not selling the illusion? That I'm not playing rich while bleeding the family dry? That I don't wear my value on my wrist? Blake chuckled. You're not even on the property ladder, Evie. How will you ever catch up? I could buy and sell this estate 3 times over if I wanted to. But instead she looked at him and said, Not everyone's racing. Silence fell for a brief, delicate moment. Then Chloe scoffed. Well, we all just want the best for you. You could at least let us help. Help. Like when you told me no bank would give me a loan and laughed when I said I'd find a way. Like when you invited me to lunch just to parade your new handbag and belittle my shoes. I appreciate that, Evelyn said. Really? Blake raised his glass. To Evelyn, our very own minimalist, always keeping us grounded. Another chorus of laughter, polite but cutting. Evelyn lifted her glass and let the moment pass. You can keep laughing. I'll keep collecting the deeds. She remembered another dinner years ago when she was 25 and still naive enough to believe showing effort would earn respect. It had been a Brookshire legacy luncheon hosted in Aspen. She had flown in on standby, paid out of pocket wearing a second-hand coat and hope stitched into every seam. They sat her at the farthest table. When she mentioned a triplex she was trying to co-invest in. Blake had laughed so hard he spilled red wine on her thrifted blouse. Chloe had offered her a napkin and whispered, You don't belong at tables like this, Evie. You don't play the game. She had smiled through the stain. But that night, she'd cried in a rental car behind a Whole Foods parking lot, eating a tuna sandwich and Googling how to start an LLC with $50. That was the night Moorfield Holdings, began on tears and tuna, not champagne and signatures. Now watching them toast and preen, she realised they hadn't changed, but she had. She no longer needed their acknowledgement. She had built something stronger than legacy ownership. Ownership of her worth, of property, of her story. And someday, soon they'd realise it wasn't the loudest Brookshire who held the power. It was the quiet one they taught to stay small, who chose instead to rise. They had no idea what she'd endured. The rejection letters from lenders who laughed at her lack of assets, the cold mornings measuring lot lines with frozen fingers, the hours spent at public libraries poring over city records and zoning laws no one else bothered to understand. While Chloe flaunted handbags and Blake posted ski lodge selfies, Evelyn learned to walk empty buildings with a flashlight and a dream. She taught herself to calculate cap rates while microwaving day-old ramen, listened to real estate podcasts while scrubbing her bathroom. Every no they tossed at her became a blueprint for something better. When she first parked her Toyota in front of the triplex on East Bennett Street, keys shaking in her hand, the neighbours assumed she was the new tenant. She didn't correct them. It was easier to build quietly than to fight for recognition they'd never offer, honestly. Aunt Lorraine leaned closer, lowering her voice. You know your father had big dreams for you. He thought you'd marry someone respectable, someone who could provide. I provided for myself. While you were waiting for a saviour in a suit, I was building an empire in silence. I think he'd be proud of what I've done, Evelyn said softly. She remembered the night like it was pressed, in amber, aged 22, standing in the study that smelled of bourbon and leather-bound books, heart thudding behind her ribs. Real estate, her father had asked not unkindly, but with the weight of generations stitched into his voice. He folded his newspaper with a sigh that sounded heavier than paper. Evelyn, darling, he said, women in this family marry into legacy. They don't build it. Hoi ngia kwa tu nai. She had smiled, then too tight, practiced, but something in her broke, cleanly, like porcelain dropped on the hardwood. That night, while the family toasted Blake's internship at a hedge fund, Evelyn had opened her laptop in the dark. How to flip a house with no money. That was the first thing she typed. Lorraine blinked, surprised at the answer. Then, dismissive, she looked away. The dinner moved on courses, served toasts, made stories, shared about vineyard trips and Aspen getaways. Evelyn listened quietly, the outsider, at her own family's table. But she was used to that. They didn't know she was the one who bought the old textile factory Blake had tried to flip and failed. That the glass high-rise Chloe bragged about, brunching beneath, had been signed under her holding company last spring. That the crappy duplex she allegedly rented was a historical site she was restoring for single mothers and veterans. They didn't want to know. Because if they did, they'd have to accept that the girl in the thrifted cardigan and worn heels was no longer the disappointment in the family photo. She was the one building the frame they'd soon all be forced to fit in. The next course was being cleared away when Blake, still swirling his Merlot with practiced arrogance, leaned forward. So about Oakwood Plaza, he began tapping his glass as if calling a board meeting anyone else hear the rumours Aunt Lorraine perked up. That some foreign entity bought a controlling stake I did, out of nowhere, no press, no announcement. Chloe frowned, genuine concern slipping through her Botox brow. Oakwood Plaza is our legacy asset. It can't just disappear into the hands of strangers. Oh, but it already has, Blake said, smirking. Majority acquisition? Rumour says the buyer's operating through a shell company, Moorfield Holdings. Evelyn's breath stayed steady, though her pulse drummed beneath her calm exterior. They don't know. They don't know the documents were signed in a quiet office on a rainy Tuesday, that the ink had barely dried before the first operational audits began. The name Moorfield was chosen for the street she grew up on before they cast her out of it. They're calling it a ghost investor, Chloe added dramatically. No face, no PR, no trail. Probably some Middle Eastern fund trying to launder assets, Blake muttered. Or a hedge fund kid who thinks they're the next Buffett. Lorraine added, lips tight with disdain. Evelyn traced the edge of her plate with her finger. They're terrified. Not because they lost control, but because they don't know who took it. They've been requesting financial reports from what I hear, said Blake, voice lower now, not impressed by the family name. Lorraine bristled. Unacceptable. Oakwood Plaza was built by generations of Brookshires. So was its debt. So were the shady transactions. So was the rot behind the wallpaper. Evelyn sipped her water slowly, letting the weight of the conversation settle in the air like fine dust. They used to call me invisible. I made it my superpower. I built influence they can't trace. Power that doesn't need a logo or a nameplate to be real. It started with a single $5,000 loan denied. Evelyn remembered how it felt sitting across from that bank manager, his pen tapping against her application. No collateral, no family backing, he'd said with a tight smile. Maybe try something less ambitious. That night, she cried in the back room of the diner, apron still on, then went home and opened a spreadsheet. She didn't need a bank, she needed a system. So she flipped furniture, first refinished chairs and repainted vanities, then cars, then fixer-uppers. She negotiated her first real estate deal in a borrowed blazer with chipped nails and a cracked phone screen. No one took her seriously, until she didn't need them to. They thought invisibility meant weakness, but it was armor. Behind every cold call she took at 6 a.m., every city council meeting she sat through unnoticed, Evelyn was building an empire brick by silent brick. She remembered the night she walked out of this estate. It was raining, of course it was, and her father had just told her that real success came from inheritance, not hustle. No one wants a woman in construction and finance, he had said. You do better marrying into influence than pretending you can build it. So she left. No money, no blessing, just a name they would eventually wish they had respected. She'd work nights at a diner, mornings in property offices, weekends at zoning commission hearings, learned everything, watched, waited, built. And when the market turned, she was ready. They laughed when she left. They went quiet when her name started appearing always quietly on deeds, contracts, property filings. Not Evelyn Moore, Moorfield Holdings. Not a face, a force. I don't like it, Chloe said, breaking the silence. Some faceless company meddling in our affairs. What if they want to redevelop? Oh, I do, but not how you fear. I want to rebuild what you ruined. I want to restore this estate's soul, not in your image, but in his. She glanced across the room to the portrait of her great-grandfather George Brookshire, the man who built Oakwood Plaza, with his hands, not his wallet. She whispered in her mind, I'm doing it the way you would have wanted, with purpose, with care. So what's the plan? Blake asked. Do we sue, file an injunction? You can't sue someone if you don't know who they are, Chloe muttered. They sounded like children caught cheating on a test, angry at being discovered. Who even is Moorfield? Lorraine snapped. It doesn't show up in any social circles. No fundraisers, no board seats, no country club golf memberships. Exactly, that was the point. Because real legacy doesn't need invitations or handshakes. It needs results. They've ordered a full audit, Blake said, finally his tone dropping. Not just of the plaza, of every family-controlled account linked to the trust. Evelyn set her glass down softly. Her fingers grazed the velvet lining of her clutch, where the next phase of restructuring sat folded in quiet resolve. This was never about revenge. It was about returning to the foundation her ancestors built and reclaiming it from the rot of ego, fraud and privilege. George Brookshire had written in his journals, A house must outlive its owners. It must shelter dignity, not just names. Evelyn had found that line in a dusty attic box, years ago, pressed between crumbling deeds and a yellowed map of Oakwood. She remembered reading it with trembling hands and thinking, then why did you let them forget? But now, she would make them remember. They've even frozen a few contractor payments, Chloe added. I had to cancel the new rooftop bar project. The invoices were flagged. Flagged for inflating costs by 300%. Flagged because your husband's firm was overbilling for fake permits. They're looking for someone to talk to, Lorraine said, eyes suddenly turning to Evelyn. You work in property, right? Maybe you've heard of this. Moorfield Group. Evelyn smiled. I've heard. They're very particular. About ethics, about transparency. Sounds like a nightmare, Blake muttered. Sounds like salvation. And as they turned their heads elsewhere, arguing over contingency plans and blaming nameless investors, Evelyn leaned back, letting her silence speak for her. Tomorrow, the name Moorfield Holdings will be revealed. And so would she. But not yet. Not tonight. Tonight, she remained the ghost they feared. The next morning broke like glass. The family group chat, usually filled with muted greetings and brunch selfies, exploded into red alerts. Blake. Why is the financial team asking for every transaction from the past 6 years? Chloe, our legal counsel, is panicking. The new owner filed for a forensic audit. Lorraine. Do they even have that right? Evelyn curled up on her minimalist linen couch, her coffee, steaming untouched beside her, scrolled through the barrage with a kind of calm that only comes from long-held clarity. Let the panic begin. She slipped on her coat, neutral beige, deliberate silence, and headed to the estate. Inside, Oakwood Plaza's admin wing chaos brewed behind mahogany doors. Chloe stormed out of the East office, first stilettos cracking the tile. This is harassment, she hissed, nearly bumping into Evelyn by the stairwell. They're freezing discretionary accounts. Some intern questioned my engagement expense line. My handbags, $3,000 for a client dinner at Le Jardin. Evelyn said, voice even. Chloe stared. How would you know that? Because I saw it myself. Approved the freeze order. I read it on one of the reports, Evelyn lied smoothly. Behind her, the conference room door burst open again. Blake stormed out next. His tie was crooked, his jaw locked tight. A man used to own the room and watching it crumble. He spotted Evelyn and narrowed his eyes. You, he snapped, you work in real estate, right? You must know someone at this Moorfield Group. This is sabotage. I'm just a small-time property agent, she replied, smiling faintly. Remember? He scoffed. Then stay out of conversations you don't understand. Oh, Blake, she thought, following his retreating figure down the hallway. I understand everything now, including how you rerouted operational funds to cover your Aspen condo for 3 years, labelled them as HVAC upgrades. She waited till the hallway cleared before following. He stood at the glass doors, shoulders tight. The estate grounds beyond looked peaceful, spring flowers lining the fountain. Inside, war brewed. Evelyn spoke quietly. It's hard, isn't it? Watching something fall apart from the inside. Blake turned. What's that supposed to mean? She tilted her head. You always said losers get audited, not legacy. Legacy still stands, he shot back. What's a line of questions compared to decades of success? Success. Do you mean stolen dividends, fake vendor bills, or ghost staff on payroll? She took a step closer. I've watched you, Blake. Every flashy vacation is billed as executive leadership bonding. Every transfer masked as community renovation. His face froze. And the funds sent monthly to that condo in Boston. Oh, I know the address. Penthouse suite. Her name's Lydia Wright. The blood drained from his face. You've been watching me. Evelyn inhaled, her voice unwavering. No, I was ignored. There's a difference. She remembered the first time Blake refused her proposal, an affordable housing concept she presented at 24. Not glamorous enough, he'd laughed. No investor wants low-income returns. She remembered leaving that meeting with tear-streaked cheeks and a folder full of numbers no one had read. That day, she stopped waiting for applause and started building behind the curtain. No, Blake. I've been waiting. Watching implies passivity. What I did was prepare. I built Moorfield, she said quietly, for moments like this, when the ones who called me invisible needed to finally see. You don't have proof. She reached into her coat, a manila envelope, his name, dates, transfers, bank logs, a list of expenses that didn't match project timelines. You think this family was built on entitlement, she continued. But our great-grandfather laid bricks, carried lumber, worked every inch of Oakwood with calloused hands. Don't you dare compare us, I'm not, she said. I'm comparing me. For a moment, the hallway was silent, just their breath and the low hum of distant phones ringing off the hook. Blake's fists clenched. You'd ruin your own family. She stepped back, her voice now low but burning. You ruined it. I'm just turning on the lights. Blake didn't speak. His lips parted as if to protest, but all that came out was silence. Evelyn watched the flicker of something new in his eyes. Not guilt, not yet, but fear, not of exposure, of consequence. For the first time, maybe ever, he realized she held the high ground, and she wasn't bluffing. You're not invisible anymore, he said quietly. I never was, she replied. You just look the other way. And then she left him there stunned, holding the envelope. In her car, her hands trembled, not with fear, but with the raw release of years kept tightly stitched inside her ribs. You watched them laugh while you struggled. Now you make them account for every false smile. And as she turned the key, a message pinged on her phone. From Illa, the audit team confirmed major irregularities, ready to proceed with the public phase. Evelyn exhaled. Let the world see. The boardroom at Oakwood Plaza had never seen such tension. 12 seats, leather-backed, high-polished, lined both sides of the long cherrywood table. At the far end sat Donovan Brookshire family patriarch, tapping a Mont Blanc pen with the rhythm of a ticking time bomb. He hadn't looked up once since entering. To his right, Blake faced pale. Chloe was too quiet for once. The air felt pressed like the ceiling might cave in under the weight of legacy rot. Then the door opened. Evelyn stepped in. No cardigan this time. No scuffed boots. Today, she wore a tailored navy pantsuit with clean lines and steel presence. Her posture, upright, intentional, commanded the room before she even spoke. Whispers flickered around the table. What's she doing here? She's not on the board. She walked to the head seat, paused, then placed her leather briefcase down with precision. Good morning, she said. Donovan looked up, his voice clipped. This is a board-only session, I know, she replied, and as of 6 months ago, I am the majority stakeholder in Moorfield Holdings, the owner of this building and soon several more in your portfolio. Silence. Then, you're lying, Blake hissed. You couldn't possibly. I am, she said calmly. Founder, CEO, the sole visionary behind Moorfield Holdings. Chloe's chair scraped loudly against the floor. This is ridiculous. Donovan stared at her like she'd just told him gravity was optional. You, he finally said, voice gravel. You're Moorfield? Evelyn almost smiled. Not because it was funny, but because it was tragic how little they'd paid attention. You never asked where I disappeared to, she said softly. Only mocked the silence I left behind. You were always the quiet one, he said, bitter. Never interested in the family business. Said you'd rather design garden benches. And yet, here I am, sitting where none of you thought I belonged. I wasn't uninterested, Evelyn said. I was uninterested in how you ran it. She opened the briefcase. Out came colour-coded binders. Tabs, spreadsheets, charts, audit logs. Her fingers moved with grace like an orchestra conductor cueing a symphony of consequences. These, she said, are financial audits, compiled by an independent team. Forensic level, verified, unedited. They detail misuse of company funds, nepotistic contracts, phantom invoices. Her eyes met Donovan's. They also document how this family has diluted and dishonoured a 3-generation legacy. Donovan's face had gone grey. You've always been bitter, he said hollow, since you were a girl, jealous of your brothers. No, just invisible to you. I wasn't bitter, Evelyn said. I was building. While you underestimated me, I learned. While you laughed, I planned. She held up a folder. This one covers Project Aspen, Blake's fictitious roof repair that redirected $7 million to a property registered under his mistress's name. Blake flinched. This one here, Chloe's client development bills, designer handbags, a 6-figure wellness retreat in the Maldives. I was networking, Chloe snapped. You were sunbathing, Evelyn replied. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The truth did all the work. I've seen enough, Donovan said, rising. No, she said, firm. You've ignored enough. He glared. This is my boardroom. She stood straighter. No, Evelyn said. It's mine. She slid one last document across the table. A legal transfer, her ownership shares, the controlling interest. The board member at the far end leaned in, reading carefully. She's telling the truth, he murmured. She holds 62% majority through layered LLCs under Moorfield. Donovan slowly sat back down. His voice cracked. You kept this from me. You never asked what I was becoming, only reminded me what I wasn't. You once said, Evelyn said, that daughters weren't meant to handle real estate, that I should marry a hedge fund manager and leave the work to the men. I took that advice and invested in hedge fund failures. I bought their debt, their properties, and I learned how to run circles around them. She looked around. I didn't want revenge, she said. I wanted restoration. But you gave me the motivation to be more than the black sheep. You gave me silence. So I filled it with a legacy. Suddenly, Donovan stood again, not with anger, but with trembling hands. He stepped around the table slower than usual. The boardroom held its breath. He stopped in front of Evelyn. Why didn't you tell me he asked not the patriarch, but the father? Would you have listened? She replied. He said nothing. Every time I opened my mouth, you filled the room with what I should be, instead of asking who I was becoming. I was hard on you because I thought it would make you strong, Donovan said. You didn't make me strong, Evelyn said quietly. You made me silent. I had to become strong in spite of that. He looked at her like seeing a stranger he wished he'd known. I was wrong, he whispered, and I don't know if I'll ever earn your forgiveness. Evelyn didn't offer it, not yet, but she did say, you don't need my forgiveness to start doing the right thing. And in that moment, everyone in the room knew this wasn't just a business shift, it was a generational reckoning. Phones vibrated. A breaking news alert lit up screens around the room. Portland Business Wire. Mystery real estate investor behind Moorfield Holdings, revealed as Evelyn Brookshire Harris, turned Titan. A board member read aloud, built 2B portfolio under a pseudonym, prioritized tenant equity, named one of the top 10 ethical developers of the year. Donovan's hands trembled slightly. Evelyn placed her final document down. This is my restructuring proposal, she said, Effective, immediately, transparent accounting. No more family-only contracts. Merit-based hiring. Tenant advocacy at the core. If we decline, Blake spat. I passed these files to the SEC and IRS, Evelyn said gently. Let them do their work. The room cracked. Chloe collapsed back into a chair. Donovan closed his eyes. You were never supposed to, he whispered. I know, she said. And then she left. Her heels didn't click like Chloe's. They landed soft and final like the turning of a key or the last step up a mountain. They wanted power they could parade. I built a power that didn't need applause, just impact. Outside the boardroom, she let herself breathe. Just once. Just long enough. Then she turned her face to the glass doors toward the city she now owned, a piece of not in name but in meaning. It didn't take long for the story to go nuclear. Within hours of Evelyn's reveal, headlines spread like wildfire. Heiress shatters, dynasty, Evelyn Brookshire, unmasks as ethical real estate mogul. Moorfield Holdings' secret CEO exposes decades of family corruption. From silent to sovereign, Evelyn Brookshire's billion-dollar comeback. Cable news invited legal analysts. Financial influencers dissected Moorfield's structure. Reddit threads buzzed with admiration. Evelyn had become quite unintentionally a symbol for quiet resilience, for strategic integrity. Yet inside, the Oakwood legacy fallout looked less like fire and more like ash. Donovan didn't leave the boardroom. Not immediately. After Evelyn's last words, he remained seated long after the room had emptied, staring at the proposal she'd left behind. He hadn't said another word, but when Evelyn walked past him on her way out, he murmured, barely audible, I should have asked what you were building, not just what you lacked. And, for the first time, she didn't walk faster. She paused, not to forgive, not to reopen old wounds, but because she understood some silence comes not from pride, but regret. Chloe was the first to fall. Her beauty blog sponsors dropped her within 48 hours. Photos of her $8,000 client handbags made tabloid covers. The word fraudulent trailed her like perfume she couldn't scrub off. I never signed anything. Directly, she sobbed on a now-deleted Instagram Live. You never signed it, Chloe, because you paid assistants to do it for you. Back at Oakwood, Evelyn watched the clip in silence. She felt no pleasure, just the cool confirmation that truth always rises. Eventually. There was a time when seeing Chloe break would have felt like justice. But that moment passed. She only felt the echo of all the rooms she once left, knowing no one would ever stand up for her. Now, she stood for truth, not payback. Blake's dissent was more brutal. A subpoena arrived. Then, an unannounced IRS visit. News leaked of offshore accounts under his assistant's name. Lydia the mistress went radio silent. His Aspen property, frozen. He showed up once at Evelyn's office. Dishevelled. Broken in a way that wasn't theatrical, but real. I didn't think you'd actually go this far, he murmured. I didn't go far, Evelyn said calmly. I went forward. You've ruined me. No, she replied. You ruined yourself. I just stopped covering for it. She offered no sympathy but no spite either. Just the silence of a woman who once begged for fairness and finally created it. Aunt Lorraine fled to her cabin in Vermont. She refused interviews. Her name trended after journalists discovered her signature on falsified expense reports for a Brookshire Youth Scholarship Fund that had never issued a single scholarship. She's overwhelmed, one family friend said. This betrayal runs deep. No, Aunt Lorraine. It's not a betrayal to expose lies. It's a betrayal to build a legacy on them. Yet, not everyone retreated. 3 days later, Evelyn's receptionist buzzed her. Your cousin Thomas is here. He doesn't have an appointment. She paused, then said, Let him in. Thomas, the quiet one. The cousin who never mocked, never dismissed. He sat down, not with a smirk, but with eyes tired of pretending. "I want to help," he said. "I read your proposal. It's solid, visionary." Evelyn leaned back, studying him. "Why now?" "Because you were right," he said. "And maybe it's time we all stop pretending the Brookshire name still means something without the work to back it up." She saw not just her cousin, but a mirror of who she might have become if she stayed. A good person buried under expectation, wanting to breathe again. "Then, let's build something we can be proud of," she said. "Something built on truth, not nostalgia." He nodded slowly. "One condition," she said. "Transparency. No more closed rooms. No more handshakes in shadows." Thomas offered his hand, agreed. By the end of the week, Moorfield Holdings became a national case study in ethical real estate reform. Donovan remained silent, refusing all press. Evelyn had expected it. Pride calcified over decades doesn't melt in days. But the last time she passed by his office, the curtains were open. A single photo sat on his desk of Evelyn, age 17, holding a clipboard beside a "for lease" sign. That was enough. Others came forward, junior board members, outside investors, even former tenants who'd once been ignored. They applauded her vision revitalization without erasure growth, without greed. At a quiet press conference, Evelyn stood beneath the restored arch of Alder Street Apartments. She wore no makeup, just a soft cream blouse and truth. "I didn't do this for revenge," she said, voice steady into the sea of cameras. "I did this to reclaim the dignity of a name that once stood for something real." She paused, letting the silence stretch. "Legacy isn't what you inherit, it's what you protect." Later that night, she stood on her apartment balcony, watching lights flicker across the Portland skyline. In the distance, Oakwood's windows were dimmer. The noise is quieter. But something felt more alive than ever, like finally this city had room for someone like her to shape it. Not as an heir, as a builder. Behind her, the headlines were still flashing, but inside something had settled. "They used to call me disposable. Today, they're quoting my mission statement." Her phone buzzed with a message from Thomas. "We've started clearing out the shell companies. You were right. Feels better to do things the right way." Evelyn smiled. For the first time in years, it wasn't a mask. It was just her. Whole, seen, steady, and finally, undeniably, heard. Oakwood Plaza didn't crumble overnight, and Evelyn knew it wouldn't heal overnight either. 3 weeks after the boardroom storm, she stood in the building's atrium. Once a grand lobby with brass railings and marble floors, now dulled with neglect and cheap renovations. She hadn't returned to Oakwood since that day, the day Donovan looked at her, not as a daughter but as a reckoning. "You were never supposed to," he'd whispered, and she had answered, "I know." But in the 3 weeks since his voice had echoed in her dreams, not angry, not bitter, just defeated. Evelyn didn't crave his apology anymore. But some nights she wondered what it would have felt like to hear him say, "You did right." And so, when she stood in Oakwood's atrium again, it wasn't just with architectural plans or business strategy. It was with memory. She wasn't rebuilding walls. She was rebuilding meaning. She ran her fingers along the worn moulding. "You were beautiful once, and you will be again." The new initiative was called Project Root, because Evelyn didn't just want to fix plaster and repaint walls. She wanted to return Oakwood to its roots, a place where families grew, not just where portfolios fattened. The first meeting brought together contractors, architects, long-time tenants, and a few surprise faces. One of them was Patton Griggs. Once the janitor for Oakwood Plaza, he'd been laid off without notice 5 years ago, replaced by an outsourced service that overcharged and underdelivered. He walked into the meeting room slowly, as if unsure he was welcome. Mr. Griggs Evelyn greeted rising. "You remember me," he said, voice cautious. "I remember you stayed until midnight one Thanksgiving because a tenant's pipes burst." He chuckled, eyes misting. "That kid was 3. You don't let a baby sleep cold." Evelyn smiled. "That's why I want you back." Jesse Alvarez arrived next, a former community liaison who had tried to organize a tenant committee until Blake accused him of union agitation and forced him out. "I didn't think I'd be on this side of the table again," he said. "You're not," Evelyn said. "You're at the head of it." They walked the halls together. Evelyn, Jesse Patton, and a few new faces with fresh ideas but open hearts. Where Chloe once saw dead space, Jesse saw a community art wall. Where Lorraine proposed luxury loft conversions, Patton showed where the old dance studio could be revived for free senior fitness classes. She met the tenants one by one. Mrs. Henderson, who'd lived in 3B for 41 years. Marvin and Lila, raising 2 kids in the same corner. Apartment Evelyn once helped paint in her early real estate days. A teenager named Kira showed Evelyn her sketches of Oakwood's garden, redesigned with native plants and benches for stories. "You draw like a designer," Evelyn said. Kira shrugged. "Everyone here says it's just a hobby." Evelyn crouched beside her. "So did they say about mine until it became a company. This isn't about polishing a building." Evelyn thought one night reviewing the restoration phases. It's about restoring faith in what home can mean. Her family built Oakwood to display wealth. She would rebuild it to share it. Donovan never reached out. But Thomas did weekly. He began leading outreach to other buildings Moorfield owned, inspired by what he called Evelyn's quiet revolution. Even Chloe sent an email. Short, apologetic. "I'm volunteering downtown, just thought you should know. I'm sorry I never asked what you were building." Evelyn reread it twice, then replied with just 2 words. "Thank you." On Friday, Jesse brought Evelyn a faded photograph. It showed the original Oakwood groundbreaking in 1962. In the background, a boy with shaggy blonde hair held the hand of a woman in a white work shirt. "Is that your great-grandfather?" Jesse confirmed. "And his forewoman. Everyone thinks the Brookshires built Oakwood. Truth is, they finished what she started." Evelyn traced the edge of the photo. Some legacies skip a generation. Others wait to be reawakened. Months passed. The lobby regained its luster. The rooftop garden flourished again. The once abandoned common room was filled with weekend workshops and movie nights. Kira was accepted into a design internship. Mrs. Henderson hosted storytelling nights. One night, Kira slipped Evelyn a drawing, Oakwood blooming with people of all ages, smiling beneath string lights. "I named this page Hope," she said. Evelyn framed it on her office wall the next morning. Evelyn, she stopped hiding. She didn't need grand entrances or dramatic reveals anymore. But sometimes, in quiet moments, when a tenant whispered thank you or a child waved from the renovated courtyard, she felt it. Not pride, not triumph, healing. For the girl who once sat at the far end of the table never asked what she dreamed of becoming. Just good work. With good people. For good reasons. At the new grand reopening, she stood before a modest podium. No reporters, no flash, just tenants, staff, and old neighbours who'd once given up on ever feeling proud of where they lived. "We didn't renovate Oakwood to impress," Evelyn said gently. "We rebuilt it to belong." She paused. "Not just to investors, but to people. Not for image, but for integrity. That's what home should be." In the front row, someone held up a candle. It was small, flickering, but real. Like the kind Evelyn used to keep on her nightstand when she dreamed of coming home to a place that finally saw her. Patton nodded, from the side eyes damp, and Jessie raised a hand in a mock toast. To Evelyn, he said, "The woman who taught us that revenge doesn't have to scream. It can restore." The crowd clapped. Evelyn blinked slowly and smiled, not the kind meant for cameras, but the kind that stays. The invitation was handwritten, not embossed or gold-trimmed like the old Brookshire gala notes, just clean parchment with her name Evelyn Brookshire signed in simple ink. Oakwood Holiday Gathering. You're welcome home. Some didn't respond. Some did tentatively. And some, like her mother, arrived early. Evelyn watched through the lobby window as the silver sedan pulled up. Her mother stepped out slowly, unsure. Gone were the pearls, the rigid updo, the layers of expectation. Tonight, she wore jeans, a soft navy sweater, and no makeup. Just her. Evelyn walked to the door before security could. "Mum," she said, voice even. "Hi, sweetheart," her mother murmured. They stood quietly for a moment. No need to recount the years of silence. The dinners Evelyn wasn't invited to. The birthdays were spent alone. The tears swallowed behind real estate contracts and midnight meetings. Finally, her mother whispered, "I read the articles." "I know. I didn't know. You were building all this." "I didn't do it for show," Evelyn said. "I know," she repeated. "That's what makes it worse. I should have seen it anyway." Inside, the lobby glowed with soft gold light. A Christmas tree stood tall in the centre, decorated not with luxury ornaments, but with handmade crafts from Oakwood tenants. Kira had created a mural across the far wall, depicting the old Oakwood beside the new. People mingled, laughed, children darted around with cocoa moustaches. Elders swayed softly to a local jazz quartet. And somehow, Evelyn thought this humble building had become more of a home than any Brookshire estate ever was. Lorraine arrived later, dressed down but still watching everything with curated detachment. Chloe lingered near the cocoa station talking softly to Mrs. Henderson. Blake never came. Neither did her father. "I didn't expect them to," Evelyn told herself. Some people fear facing what they try to erase. But part of her still hoped. At the mic, Evelyn offered no grand speech, just a few words. "Thank you for believing this place deserved better." She stepped down quickly, letting the night be about community, not redemption. Later, near the courtyard, her mother found her again. They stood by a planter Evelyn had helped rebuild, the same one that once cracked during a storm, while her family hosted an indoor champagne toast. "I remember you crying near this spot once," her mother said. "I was 16. Dad told me I'd never make it on my own." Her mother nodded, and I didn't say anything. I let silence be my comfort. Evelyn didn't speak. Some things didn't need confirmation. Her mother reached into her coat and pulled out something small, a faded photo. Evelyn gasped. It was her at 17, grinning beside the for-lease sign she posted on her very first listing. "I kept it," her mother said. "I just didn't know what to do with a daughter I didn't understand." Evelyn took a breath. "This isn't about me anymore," she said gently. "It's about fixing what you all broke. And maybe learning what it means to earn legacy, not inherit it." Her mother nodded, but her gaze stayed distant. "We thought we were giving you structure, but maybe we just built walls." Evelyn didn't answer right away, because even truth needs silence to breathe. Finally she said, "Then start by tearing them down." Her mother nodded slowly. "Can I start meet the tenants? Hear their stories? That's where it begins." And she did. Mrs. Brookshire, formerly a symbol of cold tradition, spent most of the evening sitting with a group of seniors, listening to tales of World War II ration lines and Oakwood romance stories. When Jesse passed by, he whispered to Evelyn, "That's surreal." She smiled. "People surprise you when you give them a place to do it." She remembered how she used to sit alone at family parties, pretending not to care. And now someone's mother was laughing with her tenants. and someone's daughter was finally being heard. By night's end, the jazz band played a soft final note. Children hugged Evelyn's legs. Tenants clapped her on the back. Patton handed her a chocolate cupcake with a candle in it. For Oakwood, he said, "Year 1 of real rebirth." As Evelyn walked back through the courtyard, lights strung overhead like constellations, her mother joined her again. "I hope you know," she said, voice catching, "I'm proud of you." Evelyn looked up at the stars. It only took decades, but I'll take it. Her mother reached out gently, holding Evelyn's hand no longer, guiding, no longer correcting. Just holding. For once, not as a symbol of approval, but simply presence. "I know," she whispered. "Now." They stood in silence, no longer as mother and rebel daughter, but as two women trying to mend a bridge they both helped burn. The wind whispered at the windows of the penthouse atop Oakwood Plaza. Evelyn sat alone in her apartment, one she had renovated herself. Exposed brick walls, reclaimed wood floors, a single flowering plant in the corner, and silence, the comforting kind, not the punished kind. Below her, Portland pulsed with holiday cheer. Cars moved like tiny lights through rain-slicked streets. Children in coats too big for them laughed on the sidewalks. Music spilled faintly from a cafe 2 blocks down. She exhaled. For the first time in decades, the quiet wasn't lonely. It was full. She sipped tea from a chipped mug she'd kept since her first lease signing, $10 from a thrift shop. Priceless now. On the shelf behind her sat a photograph from the holiday party, Mrs. Lopez in her knit shawl. Kira showing her sketches to investors, Patton and Jessie posing like old college buddies. A family, not by blood, but by belief. Her phone buzzed. An email from a developer in DC, a podcast invitation, a new speaking engagement in Austin. She silenced it. Tonight was for no one else. Not the press, not the shareholders, not even the ghosts of the Brookshire name. Tonight was hers. She walked to the wide window overlooking the city. In her reflection, she didn't see the woman they used to mock. Not the renter, not the plain one, not the disappointment in cardigans. She saw evil in Brookshire who built something real. And not just buildings, but dignity, trust, a way forward. Some build legacies in silence, she thought. Some destroy them with noise. She had chosen silence, but not submission. And now the silence was her power. At her desk, she opened a leather-bound notebook, pages worn margins filled with late-night thoughts and early morning grit. She began to write. To the next girl they call too quiet. To the one who sits at dinner tables and gets talked over. To the girl who shows up in thrifted blazers and gets mistaken for an intern when she owns the building. I see you. She paused. The ink bled slightly on the old paper. She didn't mind. They'll measure your worth by how loud you can be. You'll be tempted to shout. Don't. Build instead. In silence, in shadows, in values they'll never understand until it's too late. She stood walking once more to the window. Outside, Oakwood glowed. Once a monument to excess. Now a symbol of return. The garden on the rooftop shimmered under fairy lights. Tenants celebrated with laughter, the kind that doesn't require perfection, only peace. She thought of her great-grandfather, who built Oakwood with his bare hands. Evelyn reached for the old blueprint he once sketched still folded in the back of her ledger. His handwriting faded, but sure marked a garden where sunlight would fall best. She whispered, I hope I got it right, Grandpa. And in the quiet she felt something settle, like approval, like peace. He once wrote, a building should shelter not just bodies, but stories. Now those stories thrived again. And Evelyn, she didn't just restore the legacy, she redefined it. She turned back to the page and wrote the final line, build quietly. But build like hell. She folded the note, slipped it into an envelope, and tucked it into the bookshelf behind her company ledgers. One day, someone else would find it. Years later, a girl in canvas sneakers and a borrowed blazer would pull that envelope from the shelf. She'd read the words with trembling fingers and eyes wide open, and maybe she'd whisper back, "Thank you. I'll build too." Maybe another girl told her she wasn't enough. And maybe she'd understand you don't need applause to matter. You need purpose. And brick by brick, Evelyn had laid hers. Not for revenge, but for what came after legacy.